I never believed in ghosts until one came to save me from the living. Now, as I sit by the window of a house that no longer holds any darkness, I understand that some spirits linger not to haunt us, but to set us free. My name is Eleanor Ashworth, and for 2 years I lived as a woman caught between worlds. The world of the waking and the world of dreams, yes, but also the world of the person I had been and the hollow creature I had become. When my husband Richard died, something in me died with him, though not the part one might expect. What died was my capacity for pretense, my ability to smile through misery, my talent for performing the role of contented wife when every fiber of my being longed for escape. In the months that followed his death, I found myself unmoored. The rituals of mourning provided structure. Black crepe and hushed voices, and the endless stream of condolence calls from neighbors who had never much liked me, but were determined to observe the proprieties. I moved through those days like a woman underwater, my movements slow and deliberate, my thoughts clouded by something that felt less like grief than exhaustion. I had been holding my breath for 12 years of marriage, and now that the reason for holding it was gone, I found I had forgotten how to breathe normally. The nights were worse. Always, the nights were worse. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened at Thornhaven, to truly comprehend the miracle and the horror of it, you must first understand the woman I was before the haunting began. You must know the shape of my life, the texture of my days, the slow accumulation of disappointments that left me so vulnerable to what was coming. I was 32 years old when my husband drowned in the lake at Thornhaven. And for 2 years, I lived as a woman caught between worlds, not the world of the living and the dead, though that boundary would prove thinner than I ever imagined, but the world of who I had been and who grief had made me. I was 32 years old when my husband drowned in the lake at Thornhaven, and in the months that followed, I became something less than alive myself, a figure in black silk moving through candlelit corridors, a mother who held her daughter close at night, a woman who woke each morning with tears still wet upon her cheeks, though I could never remember what I had dreamed. Thornhaven had been my prison long before it became my purgatory. I came to the estate as a bride of 20, full of hope and the romantic notions that young women cultivate when they have read too many novels and experienced too little of life. Richard Ashworth, Viscount Ashworth, had seemed everything a husband should be during our courtship. Handsome, attentive, possessed of a family name that stretched back centuries, and an estate that sprawled across the Yorkshire moors like a sleeping giant of grey stone and dark windows. My father, a prosperous merchant with aspirations beyond his station, had been only too pleased to trade his daughter for a title. And I, naive creature that I was, had believed myself in love. I remember the day I first saw Thornhaven, traveling up the long drive in Richard's carriage, my hand clasped in his gloved fingers as he pointed out features of the landscape with proprietary pride. The house rose from the moors like something that had grown there, all grey stone and mullioned windows and chimneys that seemed to scrape the overcast sky. I thought it beautiful then, in a stern and imposing way. I thought it would be an adventure, learning to be mistress of such a place. I thought I would transform it with my youth and energy, fill its echoing halls with warmth and laughter and the sounds of children. How quickly one learns the difference between dreams and reality. The truth of my marriage revealed itself slowly, the way dawn reveals the damage of a storm. The first weeks were tolerable, even pleasant. Richard was attentive in his way, showing me the house and grounds, introducing me to the servants, explaining the routines that would govern my days. He was not affectionate, but I attributed this to reserve, to the natural reticence of the English aristocracy. He would warm to me in time, I told myself. He would come to love me, as I was determined to love him. But weeks became months, and months became years, and Richard never warmed. If anything, he grew colder, more distant, more wrapped in whatever private world occupied his thoughts. He would look at me sometimes across the dinner table with an expression I could not decipher, a kind of weary assessment, as though I were a purchase he had made and subsequently regretted. Richard was not cruel in any way that would have given me grounds for complaint. He did not strike me. He did not raise his voice. He simply existed in a sphere adjacent to mine, two planets orbiting the same sun but never touching. He spent his days with his ledgers and his hunting dogs. He spent his evenings with his brandy and his silence. And at night, when he came to my chamber with the mechanical determination of a man fulfilling a duty, I learned to close my eyes and think of nothing at all. I tried, in those early years, to bridge the distance between us. I studied the things he cared about, learning the intricacies of estate management and the breeding of hunting dogs, hoping to find some common ground where our souls might meet. I arranged dinners with neighbors whose company he enjoyed. I wore the gowns he preferred and styled my hair in the fashion he found acceptable. I became a student of his moods, learning to anticipate his irritations and avoid the subjects that darkened his brow. None of it mattered. Richard observed my efforts with the same detached tolerance he might have shown a particularly persistent housemaid. He was not unkind, exactly. He simply did not care. I was a fixture of his household, as necessary and as uninteresting as the furniture. The loneliness of those years is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. I was surrounded by people, servants who attended my every need, neighbors who called with appropriate regularity, a husband who sat across from me at meals and slept in the room adjacent to mine. And yet, I was utterly, devastatingly alone. There was no one to whom I could confide my unhappiness, no one who would have believed me if I had tried. From the outside, I had everything a woman could want: a beautiful home, a titled husband, security and status, and all the trappings of a successful life. To complain would have seemed ungrateful, would have marked me as spoiled and dissatisfied. So I said nothing. I smiled and nodded and performed my role, and I buried my disappointment so deeply that I almost convinced myself it did not exist. Charlotte was born after 3 years of trying, and for a brief season I believed she might change everything. Surely a child would soften him. Surely a daughter, with her perfect rosebud mouth and eyes the color of a winter sky, would unlock whatever tenderness lay dormant in his heart. But Richard looked upon his child with the same distant assessment he applied to a new foal or a promising hunting bitch. She was healthy, which was adequate. She was female, which was disappointing. He would try again for an heir when the time was appropriate. But time, as it turned out, had other plans for Richard Ashworth. The years between Charlotte's birth and Richard's death passed in a blur of sameness. I poured all the love I could not give my husband into my daughter, watching her grow from a squalling infant into a curious toddler, into a bright and perceptive child. Charlotte was my joy, my purpose, the single point of light in the gray monotony of my existence. I taught her to read before she was 4. I walked with her through the gardens, naming flowers and birds and teaching her the names of the stars. I held her through nightmares and celebrated her triumphs and loved her with a ferocity that sometimes frightened me with its intensity. Richard paid little attention to either of us. As Charlotte grew older, I sometimes caught him watching her with a curious expression, as though trying to remember how this small person had come to be in his house. He was not unkind to her. I will grant him that. He simply did not know how to be a father, had perhaps never had a model for what a father should be. His own father had died when Richard was young, leaving him to the cold mercies of the dowager, and whatever capacity for warmth he might have possessed had been frozen out of him long before I arrived. We settled into a pattern, the 3 of us, a family in name only. Richard pursued his interests. I raised my daughter. And Thornhaven watched over us all, its gray stones holding secrets I would not discover for years to come. I remember little of the night he died, and what I do remember comes to me in fragments, like a mirror shattered and imperfectly reassembled. There had been a dinner party, guests from neighboring estates, conversation about politics and hunting, and the interminable question of who was marrying whom. I had worn my emerald green gown, the one Richard said made me look acceptable. I had smiled at the appropriate moments and laughed at the appropriate jests and counted the hours until I could retreat to my chamber and unbind my hair and breathe. The evening had been like 100 such evenings before it. Lady Pemberton had complained about her servants. Sir Harold had bored everyone with stories of his time in India. Mrs. Cartwright had engaged me in a long conversation about the difficulty of finding good silk this season, and I had nodded and murmured sympathetically and thought about how much I would rather be reading Charlotte a bedtime story. But throughout the meal, I had been aware of Richard watching me, not his usual indifferent glance, but something more intent, more searching. When our eyes met across the table, he would look away quickly, reaching for his wineglass, engaging the person beside him in conversation. But then his gaze would return, and that strange, calculating expression would settle over his features once more. Richard had been drinking more than usual. This was not remarkable in itself, as my husband had a deep and devoted relationship with his cellar. But that night, there was something different in his manner. A restlessness, a darkness behind his eyes that made me think of storm clouds gathering over the moors. He kept looking at me across the table with an expression I could not decipher. Not anger exactly. Not desire, certainly. Something closer to calculation, as though he were working through some complex problem, and I was part of the equation. After dinner, when the gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, Richard positioned himself near the fireplace and barely spoke for the remainder of the evening. He stood with one arm resting on the mantel, his glass of brandy untouched in his hand, staring into the flames with such intensity that several guests cast curious glances in his direction. I should have asked him what was wrong. I should have found some private moment to inquire about his mood. But I had learned long ago not to ask Richard questions. The answers, when they came, were rarely what I hoped to hear. The guests departed around midnight. I went upstairs to check on Charlotte, who slept peacefully in her nursery with her governess dozing in the adjacent room. I stood over my daughter's bed for a long moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, feeling the fierce protective love that was the best thing in my life. Whatever else was wrong, whatever disappointments I had swallowed, I had this, I had her. It would have to be enough. When I descended again, Richard was gone. The butler informed me that the master had gone out for some air. I thought nothing of it. Richard often walked the grounds at night when the drink was heavy upon him. I went to bed and fell asleep with the ease of profound exhaustion, never imagining that my husband was taking his last breaths beneath the cold waters of the lake. They found him in the lake at dawn. The groundskeeper, making his early rounds, saw the dark shape floating among the reeds and raised the alarm. By the time I was summoned, they had pulled him onto the bank, and I stood there in my dressing gown with the morning mist swirling around my ankles, looking down at the man I had promised to love until death parted us. Death had arrived, though love had departed long ago. I remember the cold of that morning, how it seemed to seep into my bones and settle there. The mist had turned everything gray and indistinct, softening the edges of the world until it felt like something from a dream. Richard lay on the muddy bank with his eyes open, staring at the pale sky with an expression of mild surprise, as though death had caught him off guard. His clothes were dark with water, his hair plastered to his skull, his skin already taking on the waxy pallor that death brings. I should have wept. A proper wife would have fallen to her knees, would have gathered her husband's body in her arms, would have screamed her grief into the uncaring sky. But I could only stand there frozen, feeling absolutely nothing. It was as though some essential part of me had disconnected, had floated away with the morning mist, leaving behind only an empty shell that observed without comprehending. The servants gathered around me, murmuring words of comfort that seemed to come from very far away. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, draped a shawl around my shoulders. Someone, I think it was one of the footmen, gently steered me away from the body and back toward the house. I went where they guided me, docile as a sleepwalker, and it was not until I was seated in the morning room with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands that the first clear thought penetrated the fog in my mind. I am free. The guilt that followed that thought was enormous, crushing, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. A man was dead. My husband was dead. The father of my child was dead. And my first coherent response had been relief. What kind of monster did that make me? What sort of wife felt gratitude instead of grief when presented with her husband's corpse? I told myself that the relief was temporary, a shock response that would give way to proper sorrow once the reality of the situation sank in. I told myself that I had loved Richard once, or at least that I had tried to love him, and that the love I had failed to find would surely return now that it was too late. I told myself all sorts of comforting lies, and none of them helped. The inquest was swift and decisive. Death by misadventure. A gentleman, deep in his cups, had stumbled into the water in the darkness. Tragic, but not uncommon. Richard had left no note, shown no signs of distress. The scratches on his hands were consistent with grasping at the muddy bank. The bruising on his temple could have come from striking a submerged rock. There were no witnesses, no suspicious circumstances, nothing to suggest anything other than a terrible accident. I wore black and accepted condolences and played the part of grieving widow with all the skill that 12 years of marriage had taught me. The neighbors came in droves, eager to pay their respects, and even more eager to observe how the young widow was bearing up under her loss. I gave them nothing to gossip about, nothing to criticize. My eyes were dry, my manner composed, my gratitude for their sympathy perfectly calibrated to social expectation. And if I felt more relief than sorrow, if I looked upon my husband's grave and thought first of freedom rather than loss, I buried those shameful truths as deeply as they had buried his body. But something would not stay buried. It began 3 weeks after the funeral. I woke in the absolute darkness of a winter night, convinced that someone was in the room with me. I could not see them, could not hear them breathing, but I knew with the certainty of instinct that I was not alone. The air had grown cold, cold enough that I could see my breath forming small clouds in the darkness, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the green, murky scent of lake water. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow that barely reached the edges of my vision. The curtains around my bed hung motionless, and yet I felt certain that something had just passed through them, something that had left a trail of cold in its wake. I told myself I had dreamed it. I told myself that grief played tricks on the mind, that the stress of the past weeks had disordered my senses. I told the housekeeper to have the chimney inspected, to check for drafts. I told no one about the cold presence I felt watching me as I drifted back into uneasy sleep. But the visitations continued. Night after night, I would wake to find my chamber transformed into a pocket of winter. Sometimes I heard whispers, words I could not quite make out, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes I felt the pressure of invisible fingers against my cheek, cold as ice and gentle as regret. And always, that smell of stagnant water, of algae and mud, and the deep green decay of things that lived and died beneath the surface. Each night was worse than the last. The cold grew more intense, the whispers more urgent. I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat despite the frigid air, my heart racing with a terror that had no name. The present seemed to want something from me, to be trying to communicate some message I could not understand. I would lie in the darkness, straining to hear the whispered words, but they always dissolved before I could grasp them, like morning mist burning away in the sun. I began to dread the sunset. I began to find excuses to stay awake, sitting by my fire with Charlotte's governess or the housekeeper, making conversation about nothing until the small hours of the morning when exhaustion finally overcame terror. But sleep always claimed me eventually, and with sleep came the presence, patient and persistent and utterly unexplainable. My health suffered. I could see it in the mirror, the dark circles beneath my eyes, the pallor of my skin, the way my gowns hung loose on a frame that was forgetting to eat. I could feel it in the heaviness of my limbs, the fog that seemed to hover at the edges of my thoughts, the difficulty I had concentrating on even the simplest tasks. I was disappearing bit by bit, worn away by sleepless nights and nameless fears. The servants whispered among themselves. I caught fragments of their conversations, hastily silenced when I entered a room. The mistress is not well. The mistress has not been herself since the master's death. The mistress wakes crying every night, and some say she speaks to someone who is not there. I heard them calling me mad, though they were careful to use more genteel terms. Troubled, overwrought, not quite herself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, began to hover around me with barely concealed concern, pressing cups of tea and bowls of broth into my hands, watching me with worried eyes when she thought I was not looking. The footmen exchanged glances when I passed through the halls, their faces masks of carefully neutral sympathy. I began to wonder if they were right. Perhaps I was losing my mind. Perhaps the strain of my marriage, followed by the shock of Richard's death, had finally broken something inside me that could not be repaired. Perhaps the presence I felt, the whispers I heard, the cold that crept into my chamber night after night, was nothing more than the creation of a mind unmoored from reality. The thought terrified me more than any ghost. They were right about the crying. I could not seem to stop. I would wake with tears streaming down my face and no memory of what had caused them. Only a lingering sense of sorrow so profound it felt like drowning. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to feed on my grief or perhaps to share it. I began to feel that I was not the only one mourning in that dark and silent room. Charlotte noticed, of course. Children always notice more than we give them credit for. She would study me at breakfast with her solemn blue eyes, her small face pinched with worry beyond her years. "Mama, why are you so sad? Mama, why do you look so tired? Mama, why does your room smell like the lake?" Her questions pierced me like small knives. I wanted to protect her from all of this, from the strange occurrences and my own deterioration. I wanted to be the mother she deserved, strong and steady and capable of keeping the darkness at bay. But I was failing her, night by night, terror by terror. I could see the fear in her eyes, the confusion. She did not understand what was happening to her mother, and I could not explain it to her because I did not understand it myself. I had no answers for her. I had no answers for myself. Sometimes in the depths of my despair, I wondered if it would be better for everyone if I simply ceased to be. Charlotte could go to live with my sister in London, could have a normal childhood free from haunted houses and haunted mothers. The servants could find new positions in households that did not whisper of ghosts and madness. And I could rest, finally rest, free from the relentless visitations that were slowly destroying me. I never acted on these thoughts, thank God. Some stubborn spark of will, some fierce determination to see my daughter grow up, kept me tethered to life even in my darkest moments. But I cannot pretend that the thoughts did not come, that I did not sometimes eye the laudanum in my medicine cabinet and wonder what it would feel like to simply stop. By the time the solicitor's letter arrived, informing me that the estate had passed to a distant cousin, I was a shadow of the woman I had once been. Thornhaven belonged to the Ashworth family, not to me. As a widow without a male heir, I had been permitted to remain only at the pleasure of the new owner, and that pleasure was about to be tested. Lord Sebastian Vane, Earl of Thornhaven, was coming to inspect his inheritance. The letter was formal and correct, expressing appropriate sympathies for my loss and requesting permission to take up residence in order to assess the estate. There was nothing objectionable in its language, nothing to suggest what manner of man was about to descend upon my haunted household, and yet I found myself dreading his arrival with an intensity that surprised me. Change was coming. The fragile cocoon of routine and isolation I had woven around myself was about to be torn away. I would have to perform again, to smile and make conversation and pretend to be a functional human being. I would have to decide what to do with my life, where to go, how to provide for Charlotte when our current refuge was no longer available. I expected an old man, some elderly relation who would toddle through the house counting silver and complaining about the condition of the roof. I expected to be informed that Charlotte and I would need to seek alternative accommodations, perhaps the modest dower house at the edge of the estate, or, more likely, some cramped set of rooms in a respectable but unfashionable part of London. I expected my life to change once again, and I greeted the prospect with the dull acceptance of a woman who had stopped hoping for anything at all. What I did not expect was the man who stepped out of the carriage on that gray November afternoon. The day of his arrival was cold and overcast, the sky a uniform sheet of pewter that seemed to press down upon the earth. I had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a black gown that was appropriately severe without being aggressively mourning, had pinned my hair in a style that I hoped suggested competence and dignity. I wanted to present myself as a woman who had her circumstances in hand, who would not be a burden or a complication, who would make whatever transition was necessary with grace and minimal fuss. I stood at the entrance hall with Mrs. Patterson beside me, waiting as the carriage made its slow way up the drive. Through the windows, I could see it approaching, a fine vehicle pulled by matched bay horses, mud-splattered from the journey, but clearly expensive. Whatever else Lord Sebastian Vane might be, he was not poor. The carriage stopped. A footman hurried forward to open the door, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as the new Earl of Thornhaven descended. Sebastian Vane was perhaps 35, with the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent years under skies more demanding than England's. His hair was dark, touched with early silver at the temples, and his face bore the traces of a life lived hard, a thin scar running through one eyebrow, lines carved deep around eyes the color of rain on slate. He moved with the contained energy of a coiled spring, alert to everything around him, cataloging the house and grounds with a gaze that missed nothing. He was tall, I noticed, taller than Richard had been, with broad shoulders and a military bearing that suggested discipline and strength. His clothes were well made but not ostentatious, the attire of a man who cared more for quality than fashion. And when he turned to face me, ascending the stone steps to the entrance with easy, athletic grace, I saw something in his expression that made my heart do something unexpected. He looked at me, not as Richard had looked at me, as though calculating my usefulness, but as though he was genuinely curious about what he saw. There was intelligence in those gray eyes, and something else, something that might have been kindness, or at least the capacity for it. When his eyes met mine, I felt something I had not experienced in longer than I could remember, a spark of recognition, though we had never met, a stirring of interest, though I had believed myself beyond such things. He looked at me as though I were a person worth knowing, a puzzle worth solving, and I felt the walls I had built around myself tremble slightly at their foundations. "Lady Ashworth," he said, and his voice was deeper than I had expected, with the faint rasp of someone accustomed to shouting orders over wind and waves. "I am sorry to intrude upon your grief. I will try to make this transition as painless as possible for you and your daughter." His words were formal, the standard courtesies expected between strangers in our situation. But there was something in his tone that made them feel genuine, a warmth beneath the correct phrases that suggested he meant what he said. I found myself responding with more openness than I had intended. "Lord Thornhaven," I replied, inclining my head in the small curtsy that protocol demanded. "You are most welcome. Thornhaven is your home now, and I hope you will find it to your satisfaction." The pleasantries continued, the careful verbal dance of aristocratic introduction. He complimented the grounds. I praised his journey's timing before the threatened rain. He expressed hope that we might discuss the estate's management at my convenience. I assured him that I would be happy to assist in any way possible. And all the while, something crackled in the air between us, something that had nothing to do with inheritance or property or social obligation. I felt it like electricity before a storm, a tension that raised the fine hairs on my arms and made me suddenly, acutely aware of the way his gaze lingered on my face. The word daughter drew his attention to Charlotte, who stood half hidden behind my skirts, peering up at this strange man with the unabashed curiosity of childhood. She had insisted on being present for the Earl's arrival, had picked out her best dress, and allowed her governess to arrange her hair with unusual patience. I knew she was anxious about the changes that were coming, worried about what this stranger's appearance meant for our future. But Charlotte had always been brave, braver than me, and she met Lord Thornhaven's gaze without flinching. He crouched down to her level, a gesture so unexpected from a man of his station that I felt my breath catch in my throat. Gentlemen of rank did not kneel before the daughters of their predecessors. They did not put themselves at eye level with children as though the child's perspective mattered. But Sebastian Vane did this as naturally as breathing, and something in my heart that I had thought forever frozen began, very slightly, to thaw. "And you must be Miss Charlotte," he said gravely. "I have heard that you are the true mistress of Thornhaven. I hope you will show me where everything is, as I am likely to get terribly lost in such a large house." Charlotte considered him for a long moment, her small face serious. I could see her assessing him, weighing his words against the evidence of his behavior, deciding whether this newcomer was friend or foe. My daughter was not easily charmed, had inherited her mother's wariness, and perhaps her father's capacity for cool evaluation. Whatever conclusion she reached would not be hastily drawn. "The house is not lost," she informed him at last. "It is right here. But Mama's room sometimes smells like the lake, and that is strange because the lake is very far away." I wanted the earth to open and swallow me whole. Of all the things my daughter might have chosen to share with this stranger, she had selected the one piece of information I would have given anything to conceal. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my carefully constructed composure crumbling around me. I began to stammer some explanation, some excuse, desperate to smooth over the bizarre statement before Lord Thornhaven concluded that he had inherited an estate staffed by lunatics. But Sebastian simply rose to his feet and met my eyes with an expression I could not read. There was curiosity there, and something else. Not the dismissive skepticism I had expected, not the polite disbelief of a rational man confronted with nonsense. Something more like recognition. "The lake," he repeated quietly. How curious! The words hung in the air between us, charged with meaning I could not quite grasp. He did not ask for explanation. He did not laugh off Charlotte's strange observation or make excuses for childish imagination. He simply noted it and filed it away. One more piece of information to be examined later. I did not know it then, but in that moment, everything began to change. That night, for the first time in months, I did not wake to the presence of cold and whispers and the smell of stagnant water. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, and when morning came, I felt something almost like hope stirring beneath the weight of exhaustion. Perhaps things were changing. Perhaps the new Earl's arrival had altered something in the house's dark equilibrium. Perhaps I was finally going to be free. The morning light seemed brighter than usual, or perhaps my eyes had simply grown accustomed to seeing everything through a veil of exhaustion. I lay in my bed for a long moment, marveling at the simple luxury of having slept through the night undisturbed. My body felt lighter, my mind clearer. The constant weight of dread that had become my constant companion was, if not gone, at least temporarily lifted. I washed and dressed with more care than I had taken in months, choosing a day dress of dark gray rather than my usual unrelieved black. It felt like a small rebellion, a tiny step toward rejoining the world of the living. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman who looked back at me. She was still too thin, still too pale, but there was something in her eyes that had been absent for a very long time. A spark, a flicker of interest in what the day might hold. I should have known better. I should have remembered that, in Thornhaven, nothing was ever that simple. Sebastian spent his first days at the estate, reviewing ledgers and inspecting properties with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to taking command of chaotic situations. I watched him from a distance, curious despite myself about this unexpected heir who had appeared like a character from one of Charlotte's fairy tales. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, striding through the corridors with purpose, climbing to the attics to inspect the roof, descending to the cellars to examine the foundations. He asked questions incessantly, not the idle inquiries of a bored aristocrat, but the focused, intelligent questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. The servants spoke of him with cautious approval. He was fair, they said, demanding but reasonable. He had been a naval officer, they said, a captain of some distinction who had retired after an injury sustained in service to the crown. He asked intelligent questions and listened to the answers. He treated the staff with a respect that had been notably absent during Richard's tenure. I learned these things secondhand through whispered reports from the housekeeper and Charlotte's observations at meals, for I took great care to avoid being alone with the Earl. It was not propriety that drove my caution, though propriety provided a convenient excuse. It was something far more dangerous. When I was near Sebastian Vane, I felt things I had no right to feel. Awareness, attraction, a yearning for connection that I had trained myself to bury beneath years of disappointment. I told myself that these feelings were merely the desperate fantasies of a lonely woman. I told myself that he was being kind because it suited his purposes, that his courtesy was calculated, that he would soon enough show his true nature as Richard had shown his. I told myself all of these things, and I almost believed them. But then there were moments that undermined my carefully constructed defenses. Small moments, seemingly insignificant, that lodged in my heart like splinters. There was the afternoon I found him in the library, reading to Charlotte. She had climbed into the chair beside him, her small body tucked against his side, as though she had known him all her life, and he was reading her a tale of adventure and bravery, doing different voices for each character until she dissolved into giggles. When he looked up and saw me in the doorway, something passed between us, something wordless and warm, and I had to turn away before he could see what it did to me. There was the morning I encountered him returning from an early walk, his boots muddy and his hair windblown, and he stopped to show me a smooth stone he had found by the lake, polished by centuries of water into something almost like a jewel. He pressed it into my hand and told me to keep it for luck, and his fingers brushed against mine, and I felt that brief touch like a brand long after he had walked away. There were the dinners we shared, formal affairs made awkward by the ambiguity of our situation, where I sat at one end of the long table and he at the other, and we made careful conversation about the estate and the weather and anything except the tension that crackled between us. And there were the moments when I caught him watching me with that curious, intent expression, as though he was trying to solve some puzzle and I was the key. I did not trust it. I did not trust him. I had been burned too badly, hurt too deeply, to believe that the warmth I sensed in Sebastian Vane was anything more than a pleasant facade. Beneath every kind word, I expected the knife. Behind every gentle gesture, I anticipated the betrayal. It was the only way I knew how to survive. And then came the night Charlotte knocked on his door, and everything I thought I knew collapsed around me. I had retired early that evening, pleading a headache that was not entirely feigned. The presence had returned the night before, stronger than ever, and I had woken to find frost spreading across the inside of my window despite the fire burning steadily in the grate. The whispers had been clearer too, almost forming words, and I had lain rigid in my bed for hours afterward, too frightened to move, too exhausted to flee. Sleep claimed me quickly that night, the deep and treacherous sleep of utter depletion. What happened next, I learned only later, pieced together from Charlotte's account and Sebastian's own halting words. Charlotte had been unable to sleep. She told her governess she needed water, slipped out of the nursery, and made her way down the dark corridor toward her mother's room. Perhaps she wanted to check on me. Perhaps she simply wanted the comfort of another presence in the vast and echoing house. But when she reached my door, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. I was crying. Not the quiet tears of ordinary sorrow, but great wrenching sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deeper than consciousness. And beneath the sound of my grief, Charlotte heard something else. A voice, low and urgent, speaking words she could not understand. A voice that was not mine. She was 7 years old, and she was very, very brave. Instead of running back to her governess, instead of hiding beneath her covers and pretending she had heard nothing, she turned and walked down the hall to the guest chambers where the new Earl had been installed. She knocked on his door with her small fist, and when he opened it, still dressed, still awake, still puzzling over some document by lamplight, she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and spoke the words that would change everything. "Sir, my mother is crying, and there is someone with her." Sebastian told me later that he did not hesitate. He did not stop to question the child or reassure her that she must be imagining things. Perhaps it was his naval training, the instinct to respond immediately to any report of distress. Perhaps it was something else, some recognition of the genuine terror in Charlotte's face. He followed her down the corridor to my chamber, and he opened the door, and he saw what he saw. I was sitting upright in my bed, my eyes wide and staring at something he could not see, my mouth open in a cry that made no sound. Tears streamed down my face. My hands were raised, reaching towards something or someone that hovered in the space before me. And in that space, in the air that shimmered like heat rising from summer stones, there was a presence. Sebastian could see it. Not clearly, not as a solid form, but as a disturbance in the darkness, a shape made of fog and grief and something that might have been desperate longing, the shape of a man reaching back toward me. The temperature in the room was impossible, cold enough that Sebastian's breath came in visible clouds, cold enough that frost was spreading across the floorboards in crystalline patterns. The smell of the lake was overwhelming, thick and green and ancient. Sebastian Vane had spent 15 years at sea. He had survived storms that should have killed him. He had fought battles that left scars on his body and deeper scars on his soul. He had seen men die in ways that would haunt his dreams until his own death claimed him. But he had never, in all his years of living, seen anything that defied the laws of nature as completely as what he witnessed in my chamber that night. He should have fled. Any rational man would have fled. Instead, he stepped forward, placed himself between me and the thing that floated in the darkness, and spoke in a voice that carried all the authority of a man accustomed to commanding in crisis. "Whatever you are," he said, "you are frightening her. Stop." The presence seemed to shudder. The cold deepened, and for a moment the shape grew clearer, more defined. Sebastian found himself looking at the face of a man he had never met, a face twisted with emotion that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. The whispers rose to a roar, a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from inside his own skull. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The temperature returned to normal. The smell of the lake faded. I collapsed back onto my pillows, unconscious or asleep, my face still wet with tears. And Sebastian stood in the darkness of my chamber, breathing hard, staring at the empty space where something impossible had been. Charlotte tugged at his hand. "Is Mama going to be all right?" He looked down at the child who had led him to this moment, at her pale face and frightened eyes, and he made a decision that would bind our fates together. "Yes," he said, "I am going to make certain of it." When I woke the next morning, I found Sebastian seated in the chair beside my bed, reading a book, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Charlotte was curled in his lap, fast asleep, her small hand clutching the fabric of his coat. The fire had burned down to embers, and weak winter sunlight was filtering through the frost-limbed window. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to remember what had happened the night before. Fragments came to me in flashes, cold, tears, a voice telling me to look, to see, to remember, and then nothing. "You had a difficult night," Sebastian said quietly, his eyes not leaving the page before him. "Your daughter was worried. I thought it best to stay. I should have been scandalized. A man, in my bedchamber, spending the night in such intimate proximity. It was the sort of thing that ruined reputations and ended in whispered gossip and pointed fingers. But I could not summon the energy for scandal. I could only feel a profound and overwhelming relief that I had not been alone. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "What did you see?" He closed his book and met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw something I had not expected. Not fear exactly, though there was an echo of it there. Not disbelief, which would have been entirely reasonable. What I saw was recognition, understanding. The look of a man who had just had his entire conception of reality overturned and was determined to find solid ground. "I saw something in this room that should not exist," he said, "and I intend to find out why." In the days that followed, Sebastian became my unexpected ally in a battle I had been fighting alone for far too long. He did not try to convince me that I had imagined the visitations. He did not suggest that I was hysterical or overwrought or suffering from feminine weakness. He listened as I described the months of terror, the cold and the whispers and the constant presence, and he took careful notes as though preparing for a campaign. He was not, he admitted, a man inclined toward belief in the supernatural. His years at sea had taught him that the world was governed by physical laws that could be observed, measured, and predicted. Storms could be anticipated. Currents could be charted. Even the most mysterious phenomena usually yielded to careful investigation and rational analysis. But he had seen what he had seen in my chamber, and he could not explain it away. Together, we began to investigate the history of Thornhaven and its previous inhabitants. The estate had been in the Ashworth family for generations, passing from father to son in an unbroken line until Richard's death had ended the direct succession. Sebastian's connection to the family was distant. A great-aunt who had married into the Ashworth line several generations back, but it was enough to make him heir under the entail. We spent long hours in the library, poring over family histories and estate records, searching for any clue that might explain the presence that haunted my nights. Sebastian approached the task with the methodical precision of a military campaign, creating charts and timelines, cross-referencing dates and names, building a picture of the Ashworth family that revealed as much by its gaps as by its contents. The library itself became our sanctuary, a neutral ground where we could work side by side without the awkwardness that plagued our other interactions. There, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the scent of old paper, I began to see a different side of Sebastian Vane, not the stern naval captain, not the intimidating new master of Thornhaven, but a man of genuine curiosity and unexpected depths. He would pause in his reading to share some interesting fact he had discovered, or to ask my opinion on a particular detail. He treated me as a partner in our investigation, not as an obstacle or an afterthought, and I found myself responding to that respect with a warmth I had not felt in years. Richard himself had been the last of his immediate line. His father had died when Richard was a young man, and his mother, the Dowager Viscountess, had retreated to the dower house where she lived in genteel isolation, emerging only for significant social occasions and family funerals. I had never been close with my mother-in-law. She had made it clear from the beginning that she considered me an unsuitable match for her son, a merchant's daughter with pretensions above her station, and our relationship had settled into a pattern of cool civility that required nothing from either of us. But now, as Sebastian and I searched for answers, I began to wonder what secrets the Dowager might be keeping. Her hostility toward me had always seemed excessive, out of proportion to my actual sins. I had committed no crime except being born to the wrong family. I had performed my duties as wife and viscountess with diligence if not enthusiasm. And yet she had treated me from the first as though I were somehow contaminating her precious bloodline, as though my presence at Thornhaven was an affront to everything she valued. What if there was more to her animosity than simple snobbery? What if she knew something about Richard's death that she had never revealed? The household staff proved reluctant to speak of anything unusual at Thornhaven. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years, turned pale when Sebastian mentioned the presence in my chamber and quickly found pressing duties elsewhere in the house. The footmen and maids avoided our questions with the practiced skill of servants who knew that some things were better left unspoken. Only one person was willing to talk, and her words planted the first seeds of a terrible suspicion. Her name was Agnes, and she had been my lady's maid since my arrival at Thornhaven as a bride. She was old now, her hands gnarled with arthritis, and her eyes clouded with the beginnings of cataracts, but her mind remained sharp, and her loyalty to me had never wavered. When I went to her room on a gray afternoon and asked her directly about the strange occurrences in the house, she looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I wondered when you would come to me, my lady," she said. "I have been wondering for months." She told me then what she had observed over the years. How the master, my husband Richard, had changed after our marriage. How the charming suitor had given way to a cold and calculating man. How he had begun to drink more heavily, to stay out later, to return from his walks with mud on his boots, and a look in his eyes that Agnes did not like. But it was what she told me about the night of Richard's death that made my blood run cold. "I was awake that night," Agnes said. "My joints were paining me, and I had gone to the kitchens for warm milk. I saw the master leave through the side door. He was not alone, my lady. There was someone with him, a woman dressed in a dark cloak with the hood pulled up. I could not see her face, but I saw them walking together toward the lake, and I saw the master give her something, a packet or perhaps a purse. They argued for a moment, and then the woman turned and walked away into the darkness. A woman. The night Richard died, he had met with a woman by the lake. Who was she? I asked, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. Agnes shook her head. I did not see her face, but there is only one woman on this estate who would have business with the master at such an hour, who would receive payments and keep secrets. She paused, her old eyes meeting mine with something that might have been pity. The Dowager, my lady. I believe you must speak with the Dowager. The dower house stood at the edge of the estate, a modest Georgian building that had housed generations of Ashworth widows. I had not visited in months, not since a stiff and awkward tea shortly after Richard's funeral, at which his mother had made it clear that she held me somehow responsible for her son's death. "Your presence disturbed him," she had said, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. "He was never at peace while you were under his roof." I had fled then, too wounded and exhausted to argue. But now I returned, with Sebastian beside me and questions that demanded answers. The Dowager received us in her sitting room, a space so cluttered with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime that it felt more like an antique shop than a home. She sat rigidly upright in her chair, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a widow's cap, her black dress adorned with the jet mourning jewelry she had worn since her own husband's death some 15 years before. Her eyes were the same pale blue as Richard's had been, and they regarded us with undisguised hostility. "Lord Thornhaven," she said, inclining her head fractionally toward Sebastian, "and Eleanor. To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Sebastian handled the conversation with the diplomatic skill that had no doubt served him well in naval negotiations. He spoke of family history, of settling into his new responsibilities, of wanting to understand the estate and its traditions. The Dowager thawed slightly under his attention, offering guarded responses to his questions about the property and its management. But when he asked about Richard, about the night of his death, her manner changed entirely. "My son died in a tragic accident," she said, her voice flat and final. "There is nothing more to be said on the matter." Sebastian pressed gently, mentioning that there were rumors among the servants of strange occurrences at the main house, asking whether the Dowager had ever experienced anything unusual during her years at Thornhaven. The old woman's face went pale, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes, fear perhaps, or guilt. "This is a very old house," she said carefully. "Old houses have their peculiarities. I would advise you not to pay attention to servant gossip, Lord Thornhaven. It rarely leads anywhere productive." She refused to say more, and we left the dower house with more questions than we had arrived with. But as we walked back through the gray November afternoon, Sebastian turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "She is hiding something," he said. "The question is what and why, and whether it has anything to do with what is happening to you." I had begun to form my own suspicions, dark and terrible thoughts that I hardly dared examine too closely. The woman by the lake, the payments, the Dowager's hostility and fear, and always the presence in my chamber, reaching toward me with hands made of fog and desperation. What if Richard's death had not been an accident? What if someone had arranged for him to meet his end in that dark water? And what if his spirit, trapped between worlds, was trying to show me the truth? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Charlotte, playing in the library one afternoon while Sebastian and I pored over old estate records, discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside was a collection of documents that Richard had apparently deemed too dangerous to keep in the open. Letters, financial records, and a small leather journal that would prove to be the key to everything. It was Charlotte who noticed the panel, her small fingers tracing the carved wooden molding, while Sebastian and I debated the significance of some long-ago property dispute. "Mama," she called, her voice carrying that particular note of discovery that children have when they have found something wonderful. "There is something behind here. The wood sounds different when I tap it." Sebastian and I exchanged glances. It was probably nothing, some architectural quirk or settling of the old house. But Charlotte's persistence prevailed, and Sebastian knelt beside her to examine the panel more closely. Within minutes, he had found the hidden catch, and the panel swung open to reveal a small cavity in the wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from damp, were the documents that would change everything we thought we knew about Richard's death. The letters were from a woman named Margaret Blackwood, a widow who had lived in the village until her death, some 3 years before Richard's. Their correspondence revealed a relationship that had begun before my marriage and continued throughout it. A love affair conducted in secret, sustained by payments and promises. Richard had loved this woman, had planned to leave me for her, had been arranging a divorce that would have scandalized society, but set him free. I read those letters in the fading afternoon light, my hands trembling, my heart a strange mixture of hurt and relief. Hurt, because even in a loveless marriage, betrayal carries its own sting. Relief, because finally, I understood why Richard had never been able to love me. It was not my fault. It had never been my fault. His heart had belonged to another woman from the very beginning. Margaret Blackwood, I murmured, trying to remember if I had ever heard the name. Who was she? Sebastian was already searching through the other documents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. A widow, he said. She lived in the village with her daughter. According to these financial records, Richard had been supporting her for years. There are regular payments, substantial ones, going back more than a decade. The journal filled in the gaps that the letters left. Richard had met Margaret before his marriage to me, had fallen passionately, desperately in love with her. But she was a woman of no fortune and no family, a local apothecary's widow with nothing to recommend her but her beauty and her intelligence. The dowager would never have approved such a match. The Ashworth name demanded better. So Richard had married me, the merchant's daughter, with her dowry of gold and her pretensions to respectability, while keeping Margaret hidden away in the village like a shameful secret. He had given her money, promised her that someday they would be together, planned and schemed, and waited for the right moment to escape. But Margaret had died suddenly, a fever that took her within days, and Richard's plans had died with her. The final letters in the collection were not from Margaret, but from the dowager, and their contents made my blood run cold. The old woman had discovered her son's affair. She had been horrified not by the betrayal of his marriage vows, which she clearly considered irrelevant, but by the threat to the family's reputation. She had confronted Richard. She had demanded that he end the affair, that he remain with his wife and produce an heir, that he fulfill his duty to the Ashworth name. And when he refused, when he told her that he would rather destroy everything than live another day in his loveless marriage, she had taken matters into her own hands. The final letter, written in the dowager's spidery hand, was not addressed to Richard, but to someone else, a man named Garrett, apparently a servant or associate of some kind. The instructions were clear. The master's consumption of spirits makes him careless. He walks alone at night. An accident by the lake would raise few questions. You will be well compensated for your discretion. I sat in the library with that letter in my trembling hands, and I understood at last what Richard's ghost had been trying to tell me. He had not died by accident. He had been murdered by his own mother, killed to preserve the family name and prevent the scandal of divorce. The spirit had not been haunting me out of malice or the desire to frighten. It had been trying to communicate the truth of what had happened, reaching across the veil between worlds to show me what could not be spoken aloud. Sebastian read the letters in silence, his face growing grimmer with each page. When he finished, he looked at me with eyes that held a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. "Your husband was not a good man," he said quietly, "but no one deserves to die like that, betrayed by his own blood, denied even the dignity of truth." "What do we do?" I asked, and my voice cracked on the question. "The dowager murdered her own son. She has been living with that secret for 2 years, watching me suffer, knowing that his spirit cannot rest." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands. "Then we give him rest," he said finally. "We find the truth, all of it, and we bring it into the light. Whatever consequences follow, they will be less terrible than this endless haunting." The confrontation took place on a night when winter had wrapped Thornhaven in a shroud of snow and silence. We invited the dowager to dinner under the pretense of discussing estate matters, and she came, dressed in her eternal black, her face set in the expression of permanent disapproval that had greeted me for 12 years. Sebastian had arranged everything carefully. The servants had been dismissed for the evening, sent to their quarters with orders not to disturb us unless summoned. Charlotte was safely in her nursery with her governess, far from what was about to unfold. We sat in the formal dining room with its portraits of Ashworth ancestors looking down from the walls, generations of cold faces judging us from their gilded frames, and we showed the dowager her own letters. The meal itself was a strange, tense affair. We made stilted conversation over the soup course, exchanged meaningless pleasantries about the weather over the fish. The dowager was suspicious. I could see it in her eyes, but she did not know what to suspect. She thought perhaps we were going to ask her to leave the dower house, or to reduce her allowance, or to make some other unwelcome change to her comfortable existence. She had no idea what was coming. It was Sebastian who produced the letters, drawing them from his coat pocket as the servants cleared the final course. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we have discovered some documents that require explanation. Perhaps you would be good enough to tell us about your correspondence with a man named Garrett." The color drained from the dowager's face so quickly that for a moment I thought she might faint. She reached out to grip the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her composure crumbling like a wall built of sand. "Where did you find those?" she whispered. "How did you—" "It does not matter how," Sebastian said. "What matters is what they contain. And I think you know very well what they contain, do you not?" She did not deny it. Perhaps she was too tired of carrying the secret. Or perhaps she simply knew that denial was futile in the face of such evidence. She sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she told us everything. Richard had been her only child, the repository of all her hopes and the embodiment of everything she had sacrificed for the Ashworth name. When she discovered his affair, his plans to abandon his wife and daughter and destroy the family's reputation, something had broken inside her. She could not allow it. She would not allow it. The discovery had come by accident. A maid had found one of Margaret's letters, had brought it to the housekeeper, who had brought it to the dowager. And the dowager, reading words of love and longing that her son had written to another woman, had felt her world collapse around her. She had confronted Richard. She had raged and wept and pleaded, had reminded him of his duty, his heritage, the centuries of Ashworth honor that rested on his shoulders. She had threatened to disinherit him, to cast him out, to make him a pariah among his own class. But Richard had been beyond her reach. Love, he said, had made him immune to her manipulations. "I would rather be a beggar with Margaret than a lord without her," he had told his mother. "I am going to file for divorce. Eleanor will have the dower house. Charlotte will be provided for, but I will not spend another day living a lie." The man Garrett had been easy to find. A poacher with debts and a flexible conscience, a man who lived on the margins of respectable society and would do almost anything for the right price. She had paid him handsomely, and he had done the deed, following Richard to the lake on that dark night and pushing him into the water when his back was turned. The cold had done the rest. Richard, slowed by drink and shock, had been unable to save himself. I sat in that dining room, surrounded by the portraits of Ashworth ancestors, and listened to my mother-in-law confess to the murder of her son. I listened, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, not even anger, though anger would come later. What I felt was pity, terrible, overwhelming pity for this woman who had loved her son so much that she had destroyed him, who had valued the family name above the family itself, who had spent 2 years living with the knowledge of what she had done and would spend whatever remained of her life paying for it. "And I have lived with it ever since," the dowager said, her voice flat and empty. "Every day I see his face. Every night I hear the water. I thought it would fade with time, but it only grows worse. He is with me always, my son, and he will not forgive me." The candles in the dining room flickered as she spoke, though there was no draught, no wind to disturb their flames. I felt the temperature begin to drop, felt that familiar chill creeping into the room, and I knew what was coming. She was weeping now, the first tears I had ever seen her shed. Great wrenching sobs that shook her thin frame, that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. And I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not forgiveness, certainly. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of terrible understanding. She had loved her son in her own twisted way. She had destroyed him to save him, and in doing so, she had destroyed herself. Sebastian stepped forward, his face stern but not cruel. "You will write a confession," he said. "You will name Garrett and explain exactly what happened, and then you will face whatever justice the law provides. This secret has poisoned this house long enough." The dowager looked up at him with something that might have been relief. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it is time. I have carried this weight for so long. I am tired, so tired of carrying it." She reached for the writing materials that Sebastian had placed on the table, her hand trembling as she dipped the pen in ink. The scratch of nib against paper filled the silence, punctuated only by her quiet sobs. and as she wrote, something began to change in the room. What happened next is difficult to describe, and even now, years later, I struggle to find words adequate to the experience. As the dowager began to write her confession, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered and nearly died, their flames bending as though blown by some invisible wind. And in the space between one breath and the next, Richard was there. Not the vague presence I had grown accustomed to, not the shape made of fog and whispers that had haunted my nights for 2 years. Richard himself, as solid and real as he had been in life. He stood beside his mother's chair, looking down at her with an expression I could not read. His face was pale, almost luminous in the candlelight, and his eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. He wore the clothes he had died in, dark and wet, as though he had just climbed from the lake. Water dripped from his coat, pooled on the floor around his feet, though when I looked again, the floor was dry. His hair was plastered to his skull, and his skin had the waxy pallor of the grave, but his eyes were alive with an emotion so complex, so layered, that I could not begin to name it. The dowager gasped, the pen falling from her fingers, her face gone white as the snow outside. Her hand flew to her throat, and she stared at the apparition of her son with a mixture of terror and desperate longing. "Richard," she breathed, "my boy. My darling boy." He did not speak. Perhaps he could not. Or perhaps there was nothing left to say. Perhaps all the words that needed saying had been said already, in whispers I had not understood, in visitations I had not known how to interpret. But he reached out with one translucent hand and touched her cheek, a gesture so gentle, so full of sorrow and forgiveness, that I felt tears spring to my own eyes. In that touch, I understood what the ghost had been trying to tell me all along. He had not been haunting me out of malice or vengeance. He had been trying to reach his mother through me, trying to communicate a truth that only she could receive. He wanted her to confess, not for the sake of justice, but for the sake of her own soul. He wanted to set her free from the prison of her guilt, even though her guilt had condemned him to death. That is what love looks like, I realized. Not the grand romantic gestures of novels and poems, but the small, terrible acts of grace that allow us to forgive the unforgivable. The dowager closed her eyes. Her face, which had been twisted with anguish, gradually smoothed into something like peace. When she opened them again, the presence was gone, faded back into whatever realm exists beyond our understanding. But something had changed in her face. The rigid mask had cracked, and beneath it I saw not the cold matriarch I had always known, but a grieving mother who had made a terrible choice and spent 2 years paying for it. She picked up the pen and continued writing, and this time her hand did not shake. She finished her confession that night. The next morning, Sebastian sent for the constable. Within a week, both the dowager and the man Garrett were in custody, awaiting trial for the murder of Richard Ashworth, Viscount Ashworth. The arrest of Garrett proved easier than expected. The man had been living in constant fear since the night of the murder, convinced that his crime would eventually be discovered. When the constables arrived at his cottage, he broke down almost immediately, confessing everything in a torrent of terrified words. He named the dowager as the architect of the plot, described the payments she had made, detailed the instructions she had given. By the time he finished speaking, there was no doubt of either his guilt or hers. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt only a vast and echoing emptiness, as though the haunting that had defined my existence for 2 years had left a void that I did not know how to fill. The ghost was gone. The mystery was solved. The truth had been brought to light, and I was left standing in the ruins of everything I had thought I knew, trying to remember how to be a person who was not afraid. The days that followed the arrests were strange, dislocating days. The house felt different without the presence that had haunted it, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from its ancient stones. I found myself wandering the corridors at odd hours, touching walls and banisters as though seeing them for the first time. This was my home, or it had been. This was where I had spent 12 years of my life, where I had given birth to my daughter, where I had endured a loveless marriage and emerged scarred but surviving. And now everything had changed, and I did not know what came next. Sebastian found me in the garden 3 days after the arrests, standing beside the lake where my husband had died. It was a cold morning, the water still and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. The trees stood bare and black against the winter sky, and the only sound was the crunch of frozen grass beneath my feet. I heard his footsteps approaching, but did not turn. "You should not be out here alone," he said, coming to stand beside me. "It is too cold." "I am not alone," I said, and it was true. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel alone. The presence that had haunted my nights was gone, finally at rest, but in its place I felt something else, the warmth of another person standing close, the comfort of being seen, being known, being understood. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, looking out at the lake, with its secrets finally revealed. The water was as still as glass, reflecting the gray sky above with perfect clarity. Somewhere in its depths, Richard had drawn his last breath. Somewhere on its banks, he had been betrayed by someone who should have loved him. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future of this estate, about what it needs to thrive, about what you and Charlotte need to be safe and happy." I finally turned to look at him, and what I saw in his face made my heart stutter in my chest. He was not looking at the lake anymore. He was looking at me, with an expression of such tender uncertainty that I barely recognized the stern naval captain I had come to know. There was vulnerability in his eyes, a kind of hesitant hope that made him seem younger, more human, more real than he had ever seemed before. "I know it is too soon," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that everything is still raw, still complicated. But I find myself unable to imagine a future at Thornhaven that does not include you. I find myself unwilling to contemplate a life in which you are merely the former lady of the house, passing through on your way to somewhere else." He paused, gathering his courage, and I realized with a start that this man who had faced storms and battles and ghosts was afraid. Afraid of my answer. Afraid of my rejection, afraid that he had revealed too much of himself and that I would turn away. He reached out then, slowly, giving me time to pull away, and took my hand in his. His fingers were warm despite the cold, strong and sure, and I felt something melt inside me that I had not even known was frozen. Something that had been closed for years, protected by walls of disappointment and distrust, began tentatively to open. "I am not asking you to love me," Sebastian said. "I am only asking you to stay, to give us time, to see whether what I feel might one day be returned." I looked at this man who had walked into my haunted life and refused to leave, who had believed me when no one else would, who had faced a ghost without flinching and caught a murderer and given me back my sanity and my hope. I looked at him, and I knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that I was already halfway to loving him, that I had been falling since the moment he knelt to speak to my daughter, since the moment he pressed a smooth stone into my palm and told me to keep it for luck. "I do not need time to know what I feel," I said quietly. "I have spent 12 years in a marriage without love. I know what its absence looks like, and I know what its presence feels like too, even when it arrives unexpected and asks nothing in return." His hand tightened on mine. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I will stay," I told him, and I felt a smile, the first real smile in years, spread across my face. "Not because you have asked me to, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be. I am saying that I do not need time to fall in love with you, Sebastian Vane, because I suspect I began falling the moment you crouched down to speak to my daughter as though she were a person worth knowing." The wonder in his eyes made my heart ache in the best possible way. "You are saying that you love me?" "I am saying that I am beginning to love you," I corrected gently. "That I want to love you. That I am willing to try, if you are willing to be patient with a woman who has forgotten how love is supposed to feel." He kissed me then, there by the lake where my husband had died, and it was nothing like any kiss I had experienced before. It was warmth and promise, and the beginning of something new. It was the first page of a story that we would write together, free from ghosts and secrets and the weight of the past. It was gentle and fierce all at once, as though he was trying to show me with his lips what he could not put into words. And when he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm on my face, I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. Not tears of sorrow this time, but tears of relief, of hope, of a joy so overwhelming that I could not contain it. "I have waited my whole life for you," he whispered. "I did not know it until I met you, but I have been waiting all along." We married 6 months later, after a period of mourning that satisfied society's requirements without taxing our patience too severely. The ceremony was small, held in the chapel at Thornhaven with only a handful of witnesses. I wore a gown of silver gray rather than the traditional white, a quiet acknowledgement of the life I had lived before, the woman I had been. Sebastian wore his naval uniform, the medals on his chest catching the candlelight, and when he spoke, his vows, his voice cracked with emotion. Charlotte was our flower girl, scattering rose petals down the aisle with the solemn determination of a general leading troops into battle. She had taken to Sebastian with a fierce and uncomplicated devotion, had begun calling him Papa within weeks of his proposal, had announced to her governess that she was going to have the best father in all of England, and no one could tell her otherwise. And he returned her affection with a gentleness that made my heart ache in the best possible way. I would find them together in the library, heads bent over a book of adventure stories. I would discover them in the garden, Charlotte riding on his shoulders while he pretended to be a horse. I would hear them laughing together in the corridors, and I would stop whatever I was doing just to listen, just to let that sound wash over me like warm water. This was what family was supposed to feel like. This was what I had dreamed of all those years ago when I had first come to Thornhaven as a hopeful bride. It had taken 12 years of disappointment and 2 years of haunting, but I had finally found it. Charlotte adored her new stepfather with a fierce and uncomplicated devotion, and he returned her affection with a gentleness that made my heart ache in the best possible way. Thornhaven, freed from its burden of secrets, seemed to come alive around us, its dark corridors filling with light and laughter and the sound of running feet. The trial of the dowager and her accomplice was a scandal that occupied the newspapers for weeks. Reporters descended upon the village, hungry for details of the aristocratic murder plot. Neighbors who had known the family for generations were interviewed and quoted. Their shocked reactions splashed across front pages from London to Edinburgh. She was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to imprisonment, though her age and failing health meant that justice would be meted out slowly. I did not attend the trial. I did not need to see her brought low. The truth was enough, the simple, terrible, liberating truth. Garrett received a harsher sentence, as befitted the man who had actually committed the deed. He would spend the rest of his life paying for those few minutes by the lake, for the hands that had pushed Richard into the cold water and held him there until he stopped struggling. As for Richard's ghost, he never appeared again after that final night. The presence that had haunted my chamber, that had filled my dreams with whispers and my nights with terror, was gone, as though it had never been. I like to think he found peace at last, freed from the need to communicate what he could not say in life. Perhaps he is with Margaret now, wherever spirits go when their business on earth is complete. Perhaps they have finally found the happiness that was denied them in life, the love that circumstance and his mother's ambition had kept them from sharing. I do not know the answer to these questions, and I have learned that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. What I do know is this: I was a woman who had given up on love, on hope, on the possibility that life could be anything other than endurance. I had resigned myself to a half-existence of duty and disappointment, had accepted that happiness was something that happened to other people, in other lives. And then a man opened a door because a child asked him to, and everything changed. The spirit that haunted Thornhaven was not my enemy. It was the catalyst for my salvation, the force that brought truth to light and allowed healing to begin. I understand now that haunting is not always about punishment or fear. Sometimes it is about love, the love that survives death and reaches across the void to protect those who remain. Richard had not loved me, not truly, but he had used his death to set me free, to lead me to the truth that would unlock my chains and open the door to a new life. I am 42 years old as I write these words, My hair is threaded with silver, and my face bears the lines of a life fully lived. Sebastian sits in the chair beside mine, reading aloud to Charlotte, who at 16 is no longer a child, but a young woman on the threshold of her own adventures. She has her father's blue eyes, I see now, but her spirit is entirely her own. She speaks of attending university, of studying literature, of writing stories that will make people feel less alone in the world. Sebastian encourages her ambitions with the same steady warmth he has shown since the day he first knelt to speak to her, and I love him more for it with every passing day. We have had 10 years together now, Sebastian and I. 10 years of mornings waking beside him, of evenings by the fire, of conversations that range from the profound to the ridiculous and back again. 10 years of partnership, of building something real from the ashes of what came before. There have been difficulties, of course. No marriage is without them. We have argued and reconciled, misunderstood each other, and found our way back, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. But through it all, there has been love. Real love, the kind I had stopped believing existed. We have had 2 more children since Charlotte, a boy named William, who has Sebastian's dark hair and my stubborn streak, and a girl named Margaret, named for the woman Richard loved, because even tragedies deserve to be remembered. They fill the house with noise and chaos and endless questions, and I love them with the same fierce, overwhelming devotion I have always felt for Charlotte. Outside the window, Thornhaven's gardens are blooming with the fullness of summer, and the lake that once held such horror for me is now simply a lake, beautiful in its way, home to swans and water lilies and the endless cycle of seasons. Charlotte has learned to swim there, has splashed and played and complained about the cold water with the careless joy of someone who has never known fear of its depths. She does not remember the haunting, does not remember the night she knocked on Sebastian's door and changed all our lives. For her, that time exists only as a story, a strange prelude to the happy childhood that followed. I am glad of that. I am glad that she has been spared the weight of those memories, that she can look upon the lake and see only beauty, not tragedy. That is what parents do, I think. We carry the burdens so that our children can walk unburdened. We remember the darkness so that they can live in the light. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the moon is full, I think I catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shape there and gone, a whisper, too faint to hear, and I do not feel afraid. I feel grateful. The ghosts that linger in this house are not malevolent. They are memories, echoes, the traces left behind by all the lives that have passed through these ancient rooms. I feel them sometimes, the Ashworths who came before, the servants who spent their lives maintaining these walls, the children who played in these gardens and grew old and passed away. They are part of Thornhaven now, woven into its fabric, and I have come to think of them not as haunting, but as company. Rest well, I say to the darkness, to whatever traces might remain of those who came before. We have not forgotten you. We never will. And somewhere, in the space between this world and the next, I believe I hear an answer, a sigh, a blessing, the sound of peace. This is how a ghost story ends, not with terror, but with understanding, not with death, but with life, abundant and messy and beautiful and full of the kind of love that makes everything else worthwhile. This is how my story ends, or rather, how this chapter of it ends, because the truth is that my story is still being written one day at a time, in a house that is no longer haunted by anything except joy. The door is always open at Thornhaven now. The windows let in the light. Children run through the corridors, their laughter echoing off stones that have stood for centuries and will stand for centuries more. The library where Sebastian and I fell in love is filled with books and warmth and the scent of pipe tobacco and roses. The lake reflects the sky, peaceful and still, keeping its secrets buried deep where they can harm no one. And I, Eleanor Vane, Countess of Thornhaven, am finally, completely, miraculously free. Free of fear, free of loneliness, free of the ghost that haunted my nights and the marriage that haunted my days. I have found love in the most unexpected of places, have built a family from the ruins of tragedy, have learned that it is never too late to begin again. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: do not give up. Do not surrender to despair, no matter how dark the night, no matter how long the haunting. The dawn always comes, even when we have forgotten to hope for it. Love finds us, even when we have stopped believing in it. And the ghosts that seem most terrifying often carry the keys to our liberation, if only we have the courage to listen to what they are trying to say. I put down my pen now, and I go to join my family. Sebastian looks up as I enter, his eyes crinkling with the smile that still makes my heart flutter after all these years. Charlotte waves from her corner, surrounded by books and papers, already deep in whatever story she is crafting. William and Margaret barrel toward me, demanding attention, full of the urgent business of childhood. This is my life. This is my happy ending. And I am grateful for every moment of it, even the terrible ones that led me here. Because sometimes, the only way to find the light is to walk through the darkness first. And sometimes, the ghost that haunts you is the very thing that sets you free. The end.